The celestial dawn emerged from hyperspace, revealing the Ezerith homeworld of Zuriah. The planet shimmered like a polished jewel, its crystalline surface refracting the twin suns' light into hues of gold and blue. The towering spires of its cities jutted skyward, catching the light and casting faint rainbows against the soft, swirling clouds. The sight was breathtaking, yet Dr. Ethan Riley's focus remained fixed. He stood at the viewport, one hand resting on the cold metal railing, the other clutching the data slate containing every detail available about the mysterious illness devastating the Ezerith. Behind him, Captain Law leaned casually against the bulkhead, his tone carrying a mixture of skepticism and concern. "They call it Lythera syndrome," he said. "And they've had some of the brightest minds in the galaxy working on it. For decades. What makes you think you'll succeed where they failed?" Ethan didn't immediately answer. His dark eyes remained on the planet ahead, thoughtful yet resolute. "It's not about succeeding where they failed," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "It's about trying. If we don't, who will?" The captain exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." He paused, folding his arms. "Just watch your back out there. The Ezerith aren't like us. Logical, methodical, cold, if you ask me. They won't understand your human touch." Ethan turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then it's a good thing I'm not here to impress them." The captain grunted in reply, a noncommittal sound, before straightening as the ship's intercom announced their final approach. The two men walked to the docking bay in silence, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Ethan could feel the weight of Law's concern, but he refused to let it shake his focus. When the celestial dawn landed, the docking clamps latched onto the vessel with a metallic hiss. The airlock opened to reveal Zuriah's capital city, Kar-Enar Spire, in all its alien glory. Towering crystalline structures pulsed faintly with bioluminescent energy, their spires reaching high into the atmosphere like frozen cascades of water. The streets below were pristine and orderly, populated by Ezerith whose crystalline exoskeletons glimmered faintly with the same bioluminescence. It was a world of light and logic, breathtakingly beautiful yet eerily cold. Waiting at the docking platform was a delegation of Ezerith officials and medics, their ranks perfectly aligned. At their head stood a tall, angular figure whose exoskeleton caught the twin suns' light, sending refracted patterns across the platform. His bearing exuded authority, and when he stepped forward, the others parted silently to let him through. "You are the human physician," the Ezerith said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Ethan stepped forward, standing tall despite the subtle intimidation radiating from the alien leader. "I am," he replied, extending his hand in greeting. The Ezerith's glowing eyes regarded the gesture with what could have been mild confusion or dismissal. He made no move to reciprocate. "Your reputation precedes you," the figure said. "I hope it is not overstated." Ethan allowed the slight to pass without reaction, lowering his hand. "Let's get to work," he said simply. The Ezerith inclined his head ever so slightly. "I am Coordinator Varric, the head of this effort. You will report to me and follow the protocols we have established." Ethan nodded. "Understood." As Varric turned to lead him into the city, Ethan felt a presence at his side. He glanced down to see a younger Ezerith medic walking beside him, their smaller stature and slightly dimmer glow marking them as an assistant. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, trying to establish a connection. The assistant hesitated before responding. "I am Arenal." "Well, Arenal, I'll be counting on you to help me find my way," Ethan said with an easy smile. Arenal blinked, their glow fluctuating faintly. "You intend to ask questions?" "Lots of them," Ethan replied. The group entered the towering gates of Kar-Enar Spire, the bioluminescent glow of the walls casting shifting patterns across their faces. Ethan's steps did not falter, even as he felt the alien gazes of his host studying him. These were a people who had built their civilization on logic and efficiency. They had no room for warmth, no need for emotional connection. Ethan knew he would have to change that. The stakes were clear, an illness had ravaged the Ezerith for decades, defying their best minds and efforts. For them, logic had failed. For Ethan, empathy would have to succeed. The first patient Ethan saw was Lyrane, a young Ezerith whose once vibrant bioluminescent veins now flickered erratically, casting weak, uneven pulses of light. The sterile room was devoid of any personal touches, its stark white surfaces and faint hum of machinery creating an unwelcoming atmosphere. Ethan had seen many hospital rooms in his time, but this one felt colder, designed for efficiency, not care. Lyrane lay stiffly on the examination platform, his crystalline exoskeleton dulled, and his faintly glowing eyes betrayed a flicker of something Ethan recognized immediately: fear. Ethan approached with deliberate calm, lowering himself to a crouch beside the platform to meet Lyrane's gaze. "Hey," he said softly, his voice steady but warm. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" The young Ezerith hesitated, his bioluminescence dimming further as he glanced at Coordinator Varric, who stood rigidly near the doorway, observing the interaction with an inscrutable expression. Lyrane's voice, halting and quiet, finally broke the silence. I feel like my light is breaking," he said, his words foreign yet rendered perfectly clear through Ethan's translation earpiece. Ethan's heart ached at the vulnerability in Lyrane's tone. Reaching out slowly, so as not to startle him, Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. The surface of Lyrane's exoskeleton was smooth and cool to the touch, unlike anything Ethan had encountered, but the gesture was familiar, a small act of comfort that transcended biology. "I promise," Ethan said gently, "we'll figure this out together. You're not alone in this." The simple gesture drew an audible gasp from one of the Ezerith medics observing from across the room. Ethan glanced back in time to see Varric step forward, his tall, crystalline frame imposing as his faintly glowing veins pulsed with what Ethan guessed was irritation. "Dr. Riley," Varric said, his voice calm but clipped, "we do not touch patients. It is unnecessary and unprofessional." Ethan stood, his gaze steady as he met Varric's disapproving stare. "On Earth," he replied evenly, "we call it bedside manner. Sometimes a little comfort can make a big difference." "Our methods are sufficient," Varric countered, his crystalline features remaining hard as stone. Ethan folded his arms, his tone remaining calm but firm. "Then why am I here?" For a moment, Varric said nothing. His glowing veins pulsed faintly again, the rhythm irregular, before he turned away with a dismissive wave of his hand. As Ethan continued his rounds that day, he began to notice a troubling pattern. The sicker the patients were, the more withdrawn they became, not just physically but emotionally. Their bioluminescent veins dimmed as though they were retreating inward, and they spoke little, if at all. The Ezerith medics, seemingly unbothered, focused solely on biological data, conducting tests and administering treatments with detached precision. They offered no words of reassurance, no connection beyond the sterile confines of their work. To Ethan, this approach felt painfully incomplete. The illness, he realized, wasn't just ravaging their bodies, it was isolating them, stripping them of the will to fight. Something more than science was needed here. Ethan spent hours moving among the patients, his approach radically different from the detached precision of the Ezerith medics. He didn't just diagnose symptoms or analyze data, he listened. Patient after patient shared stories of loss, isolation, and fear, emotions that seemed to weigh heavily on them yet remained unspoken in their culture. To the Ezerith, acknowledging such feelings was unnecessary, perhaps even shameful. But to Ethan, these confessions were the key to understanding what the illness truly stole from them. One particular patient, an elder named Jurath, was especially resistant. When Ethan entered his room, the older Ezerith turned his face away, his dim bioluminescence casting faint shadows across the sterile walls. "I do not require your presence," Jurath said curtly, his voice as cold as the room itself. "There is nothing you can offer me." Ethan didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a chair beside Jurath's bed and sat quietly. "Maybe not," he said after a long moment. "But sometimes, it helps to talk." Jurath remained silent, his body rigid as he refused to meet Ethan's gaze. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "You remind me of someone," he began, his tone soft but steady. "My sister. She was stubborn, too. Jurith's bioluminescent veins flickered faintly, but he said nothing. Ethan pressed on, his voice growing quieter. She had a rare illness. By the time we realized what it was, there wasn't much we could do. I tried everything. Every treatment. Every option. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to the present. But it wasn't enough. Jurith's head shifted slightly, though he still didn't speak. I couldn't save her, Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. But in those last days, I learned something. She didn't need me to fix everything. What she needed was someone to be there, to listen, to sit with her, even when it hurt. Sometimes, healing the soul matters just as much as healing the body. Slowly, Jurith turned to face him. His glowing eyes, though dim, met Ethan's with an intensity that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Ethan saw the carefully maintained stoicism in the elder's features waver. A flicker of something deeper passed across his face, acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. "You speak, strangely," Jurith said at last, his voice quieter now. "But perhaps not foolishly." Ethan offered a small smile. "Strange is what I'm good at." For the first time, the elder did not turn away. Ethan's observations had led him to an unsettling conclusion: the illness wasn't just a physical ailment. It thrived on emotional suppression, feeding off the Ezerith's refusal to acknowledge or process their feelings. The erratic energy discharges seemed intricately tied to unprocessed stress, fear, and despair, emotions the Ezerith culture dismissed as irrelevant. While the Ezerith focused on repairing their bodies, they ignored the growing fractures in their minds. Determined to approach the problem holistically, Ethan began implementing unconventional treatments. He transformed the sterile hospital rooms into environments designed to calm and comfort. Using bioluminescent panels tuned to soothing hues, he created gentle, pulsating light patterns. Music, an alien concept to the Ezerith, was introduced, a soft, harmonic melody that resonated in the crystal walls. But the most radical part of Ethan's approach was guiding patients to express their emotions. Lyrane, the young patient Ethan had first treated, became his breakthrough case. At first, Lyrane was hesitant, struggling to articulate feelings that Ezerith society had taught him to suppress. Ethan persisted, encouraging the boy to share his fears and frustrations. "I don't care if it doesn't make sense," Ethan would say. "Just say what's on your mind." Slowly, Lyrane began to open up. He spoke of his fear of fading away, of the shame he felt for being weak, and of the loneliness that haunted him. Over several sessions, the boy's bioluminescent veins grew steadier, their flickering subsiding into a healthy, rhythmic glow. His improvement was undeniable. Word of Lyrane's recovery spread quickly through the hospital, drawing curiosity and criticism. Coordinator Varric was among those who remained skeptical. Ethan's methods, though effective, clashed with the Ezerith's deeply ingrained reliance on logic and precision. One day, Varric confronted Ethan in the lab, his composed facade cracking under the strain of frustration. "This is not science," Varric said, his glowing veins pulsing erratically. "You are playing with lives, human." "I'm trying to save lives," Ethan shot back, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "And let's be honest, your approach hasn't worked in decades. What do you have to lose by trying something new?" For a moment, the tension in the room was immense. Varric's crystalline features hardened, but he had no response. The argument ended in a stalemate, but Ethan didn't need Varric's approval. The results spoke for themselves. More patients began to stabilize under his care, their energy discharges lessening as they worked through emotions they had never been allowed to express. But just as hope began to take root, the illness changed. Without warning, it mutated. Patients who had shown improvement suddenly relapsed, their conditions deteriorating at an alarming rate. The discharges grew more intense, spreading faster than before. The medical facilities were soon overwhelmed as new cases poured in. Ethan felt the weight of the crisis press down on him. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. The crisis reached its peak in an overwhelming wave of desperation. Over 200 new cases flooded the main hospital in a single day, the once orderly wards descending into chaos. Ezerith medics, trained to handle cases with precision and methodical care, found themselves unable to cope with the sheer volume. Their processes, designed for small numbers and careful deliberation, became bottlenecks as patients collapsed in corridors, their bioluminescent veins flaring erratically. Ethan knew they couldn't handle this alone. A team of human medics, freshly arrived as reinforcements, joined him in the effort. Where the Ezerith faltered in confusion, the humans adapted. Ethan and his team moved with a practiced urgency born from experience with disaster zones and mass casualty events. They immediately divided the patients into triage groups, assessing severity and prioritizing care. Makeshift care stations sprang up in hallways and storage rooms, converting every available space into a treatment area. The contrast between the two species' approaches was stark. The Ezerith hesitated, their adherence to protocols slowing them down. In contrast, the human medics improvised, using whatever was on hand to stabilize patients. They repurposed Ezerith diagnostic tools as emergency monitors and rigged portable bioluminescent panels to regulate the erratic energy discharges. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Ethan, in the center of the chaos, focused on the most critical cases. One patient, Ryvek, lay on a stretcher, his body trembling as uncontrolled energy surged through his veins. His bioluminescent patterns, once steady and vibrant, now flickered wildly, dimming with each discharge. If the discharges didn't stabilize soon, his system would fail entirely. Kneeling beside Ryvek, Ethan worked quickly, adjusting the dosage on a stabilizing injection while monitoring the alien's erratic vitals. As he prepared the syringe, he noticed Ryvek's eyes, dim and unfocused, brimming with something Ethan couldn't ignore, fear. Without hesitation, Ethan reached out and clasped Ryvek's hand, ignoring the startled murmurs of nearby Ezerith medics. "Ryvek," he said softly, leaning closer so his voice could cut through the noise around them. "You're not alone. I'm here with you. We're going to get through this together." The patient's erratic breathing began to slow, his glowing veins pulsing faintly but less chaotically. Ethan administered the injection, holding Ryvek's hand the entire time. To the astonishment of the observing medics, the flares of light in Ryvek's veins began to subside. His bioluminescence steadied, its rhythm returning to something close to normal. Coordinator Varek, who had been silently observing the scene from the sidelines, finally stepped forward. His crystalline features remained stoic, but his glowing veins pulsed faintly in a way Ethan had learned to interpret as conflicted. "Your methods," Varek began, his tone hesitant. "They defy logic, yet they work. I do not understand." Ethan met his gaze, exhaustion and determination mingling in his expression. "It's not just about logic," he replied. "It's about connection. Empathy. Sometimes healing isn't just about medicine, it's about showing someone you care." Varek stood in contemplative silence as the chaos around them continued, his worldview beginning to shift. In the weeks that followed, the Ezerith medical community began to change in ways Ethan could not have predicted. His methods, once met with skepticism and resistance, were slowly embraced as the results became undeniable. The integration of human practices, small but profound, transformed their approach to care. The sterile hospital wards were no longer devoid of comfort. Ezerith medics, previously focused solely on logic and protocol, began to incorporate elements that had once seemed alien to them. Gentle bioluminescent panels, calibrated to soothe rather than analyze, replaced the harsh, sterile lighting. Soft, harmonic tones, inspired by the human concept of music, played in patient rooms. But the most striking change was in the medics themselves. Ezerith doctors began to engage with their patients on a personal level. They asked questions not just about physical symptoms but about thoughts, fears, and feelings, concepts they had once dismissed as irrelevant. Though their words were tentative at first, the impact was immediate. Patients, previously withdrawn and fearful, responded with glimmers of trust and hope. For a species that had long valued efficiency above all else, this shift was monumental. Coordinator Varek, who had been among the staunchest opponents of Ethan's methods, became one of their most vocal advocates. Ethan watched one day as Varek sat beside a patient, his rigid posture softened as he carefully reassured them through a difficult procedure. Though the gestures lacked the natural ease of human empathy, they were sincere, and the patient's bioluminescence stabilized more quickly than expected. Ethan's approach had not only saved lives but had sparked a quiet revolution in Ezerith medicine. On his final day on Zuriah, Lyrane, now fully healed and glowing with steady, vibrant light, sought him out. "You showed us something we didn't know we needed," the young Ezerith said, his once frightened eyes now warm with gratitude. Ethan smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Lyrane's shoulder. "Sometimes, it takes a fresh perspective to see what was there all along." As the celestial dawn prepared to depart, Ethan stood at the viewport, gazing out at the twin suns rising over the crystalline spires of Karinar. A deep sense of fulfillment filled him, not just for the lives he had saved, but for the knowledge that he had shown an entire species the power of compassion. Humanity's greatest strength had left its mark on the stars.